Lindsay is assistant professor and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center in Crookston. And her work primarily focuses on nitrogen and phosphorus management and row crop production with emphasis on nutrient loss. So thanks for joining us and welcome to the warmer weather.
Yeah, thank you. And as Bruce mentioned, the Northwest Research and Outreach Center is located up in Crookston, so all the way up in that northwest corner of the state. So definitely had a long drive being here, but it's always nice to be down in Mankato enjoying some tropical weather compared to Crookston. But today, really, the topic of our talk, talking about different nutrient transformations, what happens after subsurface drainage installation. One thing that we know is that Minnesota farmers are installing tile drainage. Now, this is an old picture and it's really zoomed out. It's from 1992. So I just kind of blew up the state of Minnesota here and recolored it so that darker means more tile. Darker means more than 50% of the ground. The darkest color means more than 50% of the ground is tiled. So back in 1992, when they asked this question on the Census of Agriculture, you can see the south central part of Minnesota was really the most intensively part of the state. They didn't ask this question again until 2012. And you can see in that time just how much more tile went in, especially in southern Minnesota. And then 10 years later, when they asked this question again, you could see really most of the ground, especially in southern Minnesota, has been tiled, and the tiling is expanding northward and westward, especially to where I'm at in Crookston in northwest Minnesota. So one of our big projects, when I started here in 2018, and I really wanted my own drainage research plots to look at. And so, because I'm so far north, I get to claim that we have the coolest drainage plots in the entire United States. I can't claim all of North America because there is some drainage research that happens in Manitoba, but, I like to claim at least all of the United States. And we are using these plots. We're measuring surface runoff, tile discharge, nutrient concentrations. These are multiple large scale plots. So they're not the small plots like you may be used to researchers talking about. These are full scale. They are farmed commercially at the research center with our full scale equipment. And, this makes them really good for both research and for outreach and for actually talking about what are we seeing with tile drainage. Of course, our location and our layout, we have a silty clay loam soil. This field that we are working with is a 60-acre field that we divided into kind of four different 15-acre plots for large plots. Where we're alternating a section of tile drainage, a 15 acres undrained section, tiled again, and then untiled. So we're kind of alternating that drained and undrained across the field. And the tile are, about 3 feet deep, of course, like a little bit deeper because we have absolutely no slope up there. So, the tiles do get deeper as they get closer to the outlet, and they're about 50 feet apart. So this is a very typical design, especially for Northwest Minnesota. And just to talk a little bit about the design process too, just to give you some context for maybe some of the things we saw in the first couple of years. One thing that I thought was really great is like we had some really good visual evidence that it was worthwhile to tile this field in fall of 2019 when they harvested the wheat, and they had to wait for that surface water to clear before they could even install the drainage. So, this was like, I was like, all right, we've got the tile waiting out in the field, just waiting for a day to do it. We actually didn't get the tile installed until about a month later. And when they did, they still made a huge mess of the field. They had to use a tractor to pull the drain plow through the field because it was so wet and just refused to dry out. Little did we know we were going into 2 extreme years as the first part of our tile installation. You could see on the screen that first bar. I started kind of the year in September because, again, that's when our crop came off and we really started. And September is where you saw that standing water. We got 7 inches of rain in September, which is really massive, especially when you consider our average rainfall is only about 20 inches per year. And those light blue bars carry all the way through heavy rainfall in 2020. So that was the first year we had the drainage in. And then once you get past August of 2020, it's like somebody turned the water off completely. And you can see there's like no rain all fall in 2021. We went into the worst drought that we've had since I've been up here in Northwest Minnesota. Thinking about what that meant for the soil moisture, especially for this brand new tile installation. I know this, you may have to squint a little bit to see these particular graphs, but when we started to look at the soil moisture, you can see, especially in that early spring period, we were doing soybeans, so they were planted a little bit later. So we waited to turn the lift stations on until just kind of the end of May. And you can actually see the moment when we turn the lift stations on and those soil moisture graphs start to separate out. And they stay separated all throughout the growing season. So it really helped to clear some of that space, take us off of 40% soil moisture in that silty clay loam soil. So it was really great to immediately see a positive soil moisture benefit from our subsurface drainage installation. And of course, that carries all the way through the fall and then even a little bit into the spring of the next year. Of course, then, as I mentioned, we had basically no rain at all until very late. And you can see those bars, they stay straight together in that second graph. Absolutely no soil moisture at all in either of our plots. Now, this is important because, tile is still pretty new in Northwest Minnesota. So something that I'm sure that many of you have figured out if you have tile in your fields, but it's still kind of something, a question that people ask me a lot is, am I over draining my soil? And I think in 2021, we had the definitive proof of there was no water anywhere in either plot. There was no over draining of the soil going on. You maybe would have saved a little bit of moisture in early spring, but especially when you see that bottom out in July and August, that's 10% soil moisture in either graph. There was no rain. So if you don't have any rain, you're not going to have any moisture regardless of that drainage status. But the first nutrient we're going to talk about, of course, on these plots, we sampled them a lot for soil carbon and for soil nitrogen. So the first kind of thing I'm going to talk about is about the carbon and some of what we saw with the cycling in the first couple of years. Some of the tests we ran on this, one of them was for potentially mineralizable carbon. And that's a big word to say. We're looking at how active these microbial communities are. I just have a quick graphic here. This is the most chemistry that you're going to have in my presentation for today. But thinking about those microbial pools, what this test is measuring, you're trying to get at the active carbon, which is a food source, and then the microbial activity. You're trying to see how much those microbes are able to respire and metabolize. So you're measuring carbon dioxide as a metric. And I always like to think about meetings like these when you have, coffee. This is like measuring how active the crowd is by seeing how much coffee you're all drinking, right? So we're measuring the coffee that you're drinking in order to see how active and how many of you there are. It's not a perfect metric by any means, but this is kind of as close as you can get. The other thing we measured were water extractable organic carbon and water extractable organic nitrogen. And again, these are just kind of proxies for the same thing. This is basically a measure of how much food is available for the microbes in the soil. So in addition to thinking about, this isn't really looking at how much coffee everyone's drinking, but how much coffee is available. And also, how much maybe breakfast food is available, later in the day, maybe cookies. How many cookies are we setting out as a measure of, again, how active the microbes are? But what we saw in the first 2 years, so we had 1 year extremely wet and 1 year extremely dry, as I mentioned. And we saw that there weren't really big differences between our drained and our undrained microbial communities. These bar graphs really, again, you can see there's some variability there, but that variability is really driven by the season. You get warmer temperatures in the spring and summer, and so you get a little bit of a boost in activity. And just like the rest of us in the winter, they get a little bit sluggish and cold and don't really want to do that much. But all in all, it wasn't a big difference between what's happening in the drained sections and what's happening in the drained section. And of course, this particular graph is just our water extractable organic nitrogen, but all three of these looked about the same, showing a seasonal variation, but not much happening between the two treatment methods. So we concluded here that we didn't actually see big changes or big swings in carbon, at least not in the first 2 years. We ran the Haney test, which uses those three metrics as a way to calculate nitrogen crediting. And again, really no difference in nitrogen crediting, no difference in what the soil can supply when it comes to the microbial processing capacity of the soil. Now, we did have a graduate student look at, maybe doing some comparisons on fields with older fields versus ones that had just been recently tiled. So within, the last 5 years, and ones that maybe had tile in them for 15 to 20 years. And we did maybe see a little bit of a signal that these microbial communities may shift over time. But of course, as you can imagine, they're not perfect replicates or anything like that. So our main goal, especially on my drainage plots, is to over time track these metrics and start to see, well, do we start to see a shift, and when do we potentially start to see a shift, in what time frame? Because we know, especially from folks who are working in cover crops and tillage, that it often takes 3 to 5 years to start seeing something, even if you're switching from conventional tillage to no tillage. So potentially something like drainage may take even longer to show a difference in the microbial communities. So now I'm going to switch to talking about nitrogen loss and nitrogen uptake. And for nitrogen uptake, we of course have to start talking about yields. 2019, I actually just have pictures off the yield monitors, off the combine here, just because I do think, especially in these first 3 years, the first 2 years, they're showing a good visual difference, even though, again, it's combine data, it's not our perfect metric here. But in 2019, when these were installed, we had a field of spring wheat. And you can see in that top image how everything is pretty well uniform all across the field. 2019, we had a uniform yield of about 80 bushels per acre, which is good. It's not, anything to write home about as far as spring wheat, but that's a decent yield. Of course, we were a little bit wet in that year, as we talked about. And then we went into 2020, and you can really start to see that, remember, the first section and the third section are drained ones, and you can start to see, even on the yield data, patchiness and low spots. Those horizontal lines that go across the field, those are actually our surface ditches. So anywhere you had surface ditches, you really had low yield. But I think that the bottom right-hand corner, which is actually our southeast corner of the field, and along that eastern edge, you can really see that was undrained, and we had ponding and poor sand and really poor soybean yield, especially in that part of the field. Now we flipped to 2021, and we had wheat again. And one of the big things we noticed was actually cracking in the fields. And again, it may be hard to see on this screen. It's not really blown up real big, but I have a water bottle next to a crack. That crack was as big that, I could fit my hand in it. If you dropped a pen, it would have been lost forever. So we had really big cracks in the field. But that was all throughout. There wasn't necessarily a correlation between the drained and the undrained. And what our hypothesis is here is we're actually starting to see, especially with those cracks that are not unusual in a silty clay loam soil, a shrink swell clay like we have, but we are seeing potentially compaction that we caused from the drainage installation. And you could see that crack is going down a tire tread. And so we made some mess in that field, and we really started to see that come out more in our drought year than in our really wet year. And that's important when we talk about the yields, because, for soybeans, all we were able to manage in 2020 was a 40 bushel soybean, which again, it wasn't a great yield in either plot, but having 4 extra bushels of soybeans with our drained versus our undrained really did kind of make or break that year for us. When I talked to the guy who farms this, he says his goal is like his break even point where he considers for soybeans is about 40 bushels per acre. So we made a break even point with our drained field that we didn't hit in the undrained field. So that was a good success, at least in 2020. And of course, that number is probably a few years old. So I don't know if break even is still 40 bushels per acre, but it was in 2020. And for wheat, of course, you could see really poor yields in both sides of 55, 60, a lot of variability from the drought. But again, I will say this really wasn't an effective drainage. This because we didn't have really any drainage affecting either way. This was 10% soil moisture in July and August when that wheat crop really needs water. Neither side had any water. Since 2020, we haven't seen really dramatic improvements in yield, but we have had less rain. And we've kind of been in a drier cycle ever since. I think 2021 was the driest, but 2022 was dry during the growing season. 23 and 24 was the first time we really started to see actually any water flowing through the drain tiles again. And of course, by 2025, this past year, we're starting to see some of that drainage and yielding higher wheat. Again, it's still a lot of variability, and we're still going to keep tracking this. So, but our first and most dramatic year was still 2020. One thing to point out, which is really important, because I don't know that there's a lot of sugar beet growers out here in the audience, but we did get better sugar yields out of our beets in the drain portion of the fields in 2024. This is important because American Crystal, which is the co-op in my growing area, will pay a premium on sugar. So seeing a higher sugar percentage, especially for the sugar beets in Northwest Minnesota, that was also a really good outcome that, that meant that the drainage actually being a little bit more profitable than the undrained in 2024. But like I mentioned, we've really had less than 20 inches of rain on average. 2022 shows up as a wet year, but we still think of it as dry because all of that rain happened to fall in April and really was well before we were able to get out in the field and take advantage of it. But other than that, you can see our 5-year average and our 10-year average have all been below 20 inches of rain. So I do think that one of the messages, especially when we think about drainage, is that when you have the rain, especially in 2020 when we had 7 inches of rain in July, boy, that drainage tile really paid off. Now, looking at the return, it's going to be a little bit different for Northwest Minnesota than it would be for here, where you do get more rainfall and more consistent rain. And you've had some really heavy rains in the last couple seasons. But even in Northwest Minnesota, I think we're seeing good results. And when we had the rain, when we had that 25 inches of rain, it really paid off. So we're still tracking this. But I'm really supposed to be talking about nitrogen. So we are going to talk a little bit more about what we saw again in those first 2 extreme years with nitrogen movement. So one of the things we measured in addition to thinking about yield is we also measured our gaseous emissions of nitrogen. So what's being emitted from the soil. And in 2020, we actually saw that our undrained sections where we had more water standing, more soil moisture, that kind of darker blue line, green line is showing that throughout the entire growing season, we had more nitrate losses into the air through our undrained system than our drained system. And this kind of makes sense because when microbes are underwater, when they can't breathe oxygen, they will breathe nitrogen, is a really simplistic way of thinking about it. So they're using that nitrogen in the soil. Your plant isn't able to use it. The microbes are using it and they're breathing it out. So this is just lost nitrogen. And this is really striking to see the difference between our drained and our undrained. And of course, this is cumulative. So it's accumulating all throughout the growing season. And by the end, you can see more nitrogen was lost from our undrained section than our drained section. And it came to be about, I have it kilograms nitrogen per hectare, but you can really, that's about the same as pounds per acre. And so we lost about 4 pounds per acre of nitrogen just through volatilization processes in our undrained section versus maybe more like 3 in our drained portion. So we saved about a pound of nitrogen per acre with drainage compared to the undrained. That was just all about the microbes being a little bit more able to respire oxygen as opposed to nitrogen. In 2021, again, we were in that really dry cycle, but what we saw here is the effect of snow melt and those early season losses. Really, the most dramatic instance of the microbes using the nitrogen happened right away in May. And you can see in that time, the undrained jumped way ahead of our undrained, and those microbes were really respiring a lot of nitrogen in that time. So even before the crop was even planted, this was again wheat. Well, the crop actually probably was planted by the time we got out there, but that early season period, which is really critical, we lost about 3 to 4 pounds of nitrogen right away in our undrained, whereas that was kept a little bit lower. Of course, the drained section did kind of catch up, if you will, throughout the rest of the season. We had, again, hot temperatures and those microbes were really pretty active, but really about most of that was happening early in the growing season when we would like the wheat to be taking up that nitrogen, not the microbes. So again, saw a pretty big jump there with our undrained. But what's happening in the tile lines? Well, this is maybe a less interesting story because in 2020, those tiles were flowing all the time. And in 2021, they shut off. We had no water flow through the tiles at all in 2021, even just maybe like a couple times during that snow melt period. But really, things were pretty dry and uninteresting in those first 2 years. So instead, I'm going to show you what happened the next 3 years. So in 2022, again, we were still pretty dry. We had a snow melt flush. We started to see a little bit of nitrogen. Those nitrate concentrations are pretty low. And we have actually our surface concentrations in the blue and our subsurface concentrations, our tile concentrations are in orange. And you can see really they were pretty low. We started to have just a little bit of flow through the tiles and a little bit of rainfall. As we started to step up in our total rainfall, what you also see is more and more nitrogen flushing out through the tile. And what this is saying to me is that we didn't have very much water movement downward through the soil profile. That nitrogen was pretty much staying where we put it, especially in 2021, it didn't move at all. In 2022, it moved a little bit. And it wasn't until 2024 when we really started to see water through the tile, nitrogen movement through the soil profile. So these concentrations are actually indicative more of our drought cycle, and that when we came out of our drought cycle, now we're seeing water flush through the soil profile. Now we're seeing those nitrate losses as opposed to anything else. And I think this is a good way to think about it because the water is what's moving the nitrogen through the soil. It's not necessarily a 1 year in and a 1 year out. I think a lot of what we saw, those higher concentrations where we're actually starting to get above 10 part per million nitrate, is actually just due to us coming out of a drought cycle. It's not coming because, we happen to grow one crop versus another. It's not 1 year in, 1 year out. It is all about water movement through the soil profile. So if weather is ultimately what's controlling nitrogen loss, what can we actually do about it? There are a lot of different potential solutions. I know you hear a lot about cover crops and a lot about, reducing your nitrate losses. One practice that I always like to think about too is also controlled drainage. This is about actually trying to manage your water, manage your drain flow, to try to prevent some losses, especially during the off season. This is really more of an off season practice. In the non-growing season, kind of the old school way of doing this is just physically adding a control structure at the outlet of your drain tile, stacking up boards in it, kind of acting like a dam at the outlet of your drain tile to slow the flow of water. But those boards are removable so that you can have that full extent of drainage when you really need it, which is planting and harvest and while you have a growing crop. If you do get dry, you can always be a little bit flexible, add some boards back in, attempt to hold back water. It does come with a little more risk. If you happen to get a really heavy rainfall event, you may want to go back out and manage that a little bit more. They are coming out with more structures that are automated that will do this automatically. So you don't actually have to physically go out and pull boards. But this is just one option that I think is something that I would love people to be thinking about a little bit more, especially as we come into an environment where those nitrate losses are really being scrutinized. One other thing that I think is really cool about controlled drainage is that we did a big synthesis study all across from southern Minnesota to North Carolina and found really consistent performance just with that simple management. That kind of after you're harvesting, getting the boards in, pulling them after, before planting, draining it fully and adding them back in, really a 30 to 50% reduction in nitrate load, more or less across the board with really simple management. Of course, this works the best at reducing winter drain flow, as you can imagine. That's when you're kind of trying to stop the flow. And, in winters where we don't have any drain flow, this is going to be your effect is going to be seen in kind of early spring and fall, kind of between the thaw and the freeze up. And again, it's just kind of during those intermittent periods. But even when we think about South Dakota and Minnesota, it still followed that same trend of about 30 to 50% discharge reduction annually. And I'm happy to always talk more about controlled drainage, but in the interest of time. So we saw that nitrogen loss, both in air and the water, were really influenced by those rainfall patterns. The tile did help, I think, improve the consistency of crop yields from year to year. But of course, we do know that tile comes with that trade-off of more nitrate loss and more leaching potential. That balance, of course, there's always going to be more nitrogen going into the crop than is coming out the tile, but the amount of tile that's coming through is really tied to the rainfall. And of course, I like controlled drainage as one option to limit nitrogen loss outside the growing season. We have one more topic we have to cover before I can answer questions. 10 minutes. Okay, I think we can go through this quickly. Phosphorus in surface runoff and tile drainage. Phosphorus losses are a little bit different than nitrogen and carbon because it's less microbially driven. This is all about the physics and the hydrology. Phosphorus losses in surface runoff are fast and intense. You get a 5-inch rainfall event, it overwhelms the soil, it carries water and soil with it. In tile losses, those are slow and steady. This is your tortoise and the hare situation. You see that's slow, steady flow of phosphorus out of the tile. It's very low concentrations. It's probably measuring 0.01 to 0.02 parts per million. But if you have tile losses every single day, that can potentially add up over the growing season. And we definitely saw this on my drainage plots as well. Higher concentrations in the surface runoff than in the tile. Not as much tied to the cumulative rainfall rate, because this is all about event-driven flow. This is how many 3-inch rainfall events did you have? How many 5-inch rainfall events did you have is really going to drive those concentrations. But to help answer this question, I pulled from a lot of my colleagues that have been collecting data all across Minnesota for many years, looking at sources from the Discovery Farms and Minnesota Department of Ag and various University of Minnesota studies to kind of try to get an idea of this. And if you want a deeper dive on this, you could probably go back and find the recording of last year's Nutrient Management Conference where I do a deep dive into this data. But just the Cliff Notes version here, we saw greater discharge out of our tiled fields all across the board, where you had tiled that's kind of the light blue versus surface runoff being pretty consistent throughout at about 2 inches per year, with more water running through the tile, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is what you want the tile to do. You want the tile to be moving that moisture, that gravity moisture out of soil profile. This is what's helping your yields at the end of the day. But when it comes to phosphorus, you're starting to think, okay, well, we have a lot more tile flow, a lot less surface discharge. So where does this come out? In this case, the tortoise never catches up to the hare. We actually still have much greater load of phosphorus from our surface runoff than our tile, especially when you think about the size difference in those bars. really the tile is not a phosphorus problem here, not in Minnesota. And we see that really across the board. Surface runoff, though, that can add up. Really the thing though is even at current prices, this level of phosphorus loss is only about $1 per acre. That's why we don't talk about it a whole lot when it comes to, what is it costing you in terms of fertility. We're more talking about it in terms of what are you losing in soil and the soil health. And this is, again, a picture of my own tiled field after a heavy spring snow melt. So the ground is still frozen, the tiles are disconnected, all of that surface water just slid right off the top and into the ditch. So I'm exposing my own farm here, not anybody else's. But just to wrap this one up, phosphorus loss is really influenced by that proportion of surface runoff to tile discharge. But in a lot of cases, it's due to, again, what type of rainfall do you get? How fast, how quickly are those happening? We can definitely reduce the potential for phosphorus loss. Again, becomes more of a surface runoff problem. So that becomes more of an erosion control. This is where something like, having a cover crop or a vegetative buffer, something that can maybe help stop that overspill over the side of the ditch is going to be helpful. Reduce tillage, all of those. Okay, so just to summarize everything I sent at you in the last 30 minutes, we did not see tile affecting our carbon cycling in those first 2 years. We're still thinking we may see benefits over time, but really no big differences in the first 2 years, which I think is also ultimately good news for soil health. We didn't go out and destroy all of our soil carbon by draining in the first 2 years, which was a concern and a hypothesis that we had. Rain is a really big factor, whether nitrogen is taken up or lost, really versus the air or the tile. And I thought that controlled drainage is one of our better underutilized tools that we could be using to help manage the timing of that nitrate loss. And then finally, we saw that phosphorus cycling, which really is just phosphorus losses, being really influenced by that surface runoff and the concentrations relative to tile discharge. And so your erosion control in those cases is going to be your best defense against losing that phosphorus per acre. So with that, I'll just say thank you all. Of course, there's a variety of funding sources and a lot of partners that we had to make this possible. And I think we will have a few minutes for Q&A. So I just... Okay, all right. Yeah, so this is a good question, this first one. Were the drained and undrained plots planted on the same day? And could it be planted earlier to capture that yield potential? So that is always one of the flaws of doing this on kind of any kind of plots, as opposed to, doing side-by-side fields, is yes, they were planted on the same day. Anecdotally, the guys who farm this have told me they do feel like they can get this field in sooner in their rotation than they were able to previously. I'd have to dig back into the data and the farm records to see if that's really holding true. But we are not able to necessarily get into that field any earlier. Part of the reason for that is we're farming perpendicular to the tile lines. And so, in order to get into the drained part of the field, you're actually driving through the undrained part of the field and you're driving crosswise. So there is probably some untapped potential there that could be, even if you're planting on the same day, you're maybe losing on 1 or 2 extra growing season days that you could be tapping into. So yeah, that is one flaw of the. Okay, do you anticipate tiling increasing in pace or slowing down? I think anytime we have a wet spring, that tiling is going to increase. I see tiling as something that guys really want to do. It's just, do they have the money to do it or not? So right now in this economy, it's going to slow down. But if we start to see commodity prices pick back up, I think we're going to see the tiling increase, because I think there's a lot of benefit there and not a lot of downsides. So I do anticipate it kind of staying the same or speeding up, but really being economics limited as opposed to anything else. Okay. With the increase in nitrate losses as rainfall increases, where would the nitrate find the soil? Wait, so where would the nitrate find the soil? Didn't have the drain tile installed. Okay. Would it flush through or be saved in the soil for a following season? So this is something that one of the reasons we're doing a lot of intensive soil sampling is to try to help answer that question. I do think that those nitrates probably would stay in the soil profile, but they'd stay closer to the surface. They're not going to move down as far. And kind of one of the things that you could start to see is that, yeah, a little bit of that nitrogen moving out the drain tile more than what's staying in the field. So we don't have a good, really clear answer on this yet, but I definitely think it's a possibility that it would eventually flush through. One of the things when you get to these heavy drained soils that really benefit from drainage is that water, as you know, can only move like about 1 inch per hour on its own. It's really, really slow to move through the soil on its own. So it could be saved for fall and growing season. That was one of our main interests in kind of looking at this, was to see, do we see any fertility aspects of this? That's part of what AFREC had, funded for this, but we didn't see a lot of evidence of it making a substantial difference at the end of the day, in terms of like, is this going to make you change a nitrogen management decision? Probably not. I mean, yes, that soil nitrogen is going to stay there in the soil, but the differences, again, are going to be maybe like 1 pound per acre, 2 pounds per acre, not necessarily enough to really change what you're applying on a year-to-year basis. Okay.